Hello and welcome to the Alpine Valley School podcast. I'm your host, Mark Gallivan, a former AVS student, a graduate, and a current staff member at the school. Now I know what you may be thinking, who isn't this Mark person? Well, that is me. You may know me as Melissa or Missa, but I am changing my name to Mark, so that's what you'll hear me referred to as going forward. My new email address, by the way, is mark, M-A-R-C, at alpinevalley.school.com, and you can contact me there if you wish. This is episode 20 of the Alpine Valley School podcast. You can find show notes for this episode at alpinevalleySchool.com/podcast/EP20 for episode 20. I've been trying to make a habit of every 10 episodes doing a really special episode, and I think this one fits the pattern. It doesn't feature a lot of different people, like the other one, like episode 10, which I'll link to in the show notes, which has remained one of our most popular episodes, but actually only features one person, but he's a very special person, so I think it counts. Before we jump into that, I do want to issue one quick correction. In the last episode, when I was talking about starting the podcast, I think I made it sound very much like I did it all on my own, but actually I had a huge amount of help from a couple of Alpine Valley School graduates, from M. Eliason, who helped me set up all the audio equipment and taught me a little bit about sound recording, plus composing the beginning and closing themes for this show that we still use, and Vanessa Reich-Shackelford, who pretty much taught me everything there is to know about podcasting, and there would definitely be no show without her. So I realized in listening to episode 19 that I made it sound like I was entirely operating solo, and that is not the case. So I want to acknowledge those two very special women who helped me make this a reality. So far, every episode of this show has been about our own school, about Alpine Valley School. But there is a huge network of Sudbury schools or democratic schools out there in the United States and actually out in the world. And I wanted to step away temporarily from our own environment, from our comfort zone, and talk about another school. The school is the Circle School. So if you will, close your eyes and fly with me from Colorado all the way to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, to the Circle School. The school was founded in 1965, and I was fortunate enough for this episode to score an interview with Jim Reap Mulder, who is one of the original founders of the school, and who is still a current staff member after 34 years. Jim is one of my favorite people, personally, and I think he's a great role model for anyone who's involved with a democratic school. He has this way of taking information and condensing it down to its essence, which is so valuable, and creates these sound bites, and you'll hear them in just a moment, that are just perfect, like too perfect to be human. But he manages it, and I really am so excited to share that with all of you. In our interview, Jim talks a little bit about how the Circle School is different from some of the other Sudbury identified democratic schools, walks us through some of their unique practices, and shares information about how their students found success in college after graduation from the Circle School. That part in particular, you are going to want to stick around for because it is gold. You will not want to miss that, especially if you are a Sudbury or democratic schooling parent. With the preview out of the way, let me just go ahead and play you the real thing. Jim Reap Mulder, Circle School. Here's our conversation. Hi, Jim. Thanks for being on the show.
My pleasure.
Would you start by introducing yourself to our listeners?
I'm Jim Reap Mulder. I'm a staff member at the Circle School in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and I'm also a founder of the Circle School.
And how long ago was it that you founded the school, or at least had a part in that?
34 years. I've been with the school from the beginning, and that was in 1984. So yeah, started with 34 years.
Oh, wow. That's quite a long road. And in all of those 34 years, have you ever had a moment where you thought, like, what am I doing? Is this the right choice? Is this the right environment? Has that come up for you?
Well, sure. I think founders have the same doubts that many parents do. In the early years, I think we wondered, as many people do, what if this doesn't work? Am I going to ruin my kids' lives? How am I going to explain this to my friends and family? So sure, we've had those doubts, but now after doing this for 34 years, it feels very different. I think every child is different, every family is different, but the patterns have become clear. The What rings out loud and clear is that character and intelligence emerge from kids' passionate pursuit of their self-determined adventures, um, personally meaningful challenges. We've seen it in hundreds of children and teens. So the doubts we have now are not so much about the power of self-directed democratic schooling, but more about trends in the larger culture generally and education in particular. But no, I think at this point the doubts are resolved over democratic schooling.
Mm. And because you've seen so many examples of kids really thriving in that environment?
Yes, we've seen tremendous variety in kids and in families. One of the ways we interpret the idea of democratic schooling is to be available to as many families as we possibly can, and to have a community that is as diverse as the community we're immersed in, and we do. We One of our two founding missions is to not just to run a democratic school, but also to do so in ways that could be broadly applied, and to make ourselves available as an option for wide application. And so we've seen a tremendous amount of diversity and variety.
And what are some of the ways that you make the school more broadly available?
Well, financial aid is one of them. We use an unusual system of financial aid. Many schools, a traditional system is set up to start with a pot of money and distribute it based on financial need. We do it a little bit differently. We pretend that we have an infinite pot of money. Families go through the financial aid process, and the Circle School is committed to abiding by the results of that process. So each family pays what that system determines that they can pay. We know from our studies that about 30% of our families have household incomes of under $35,000. That's a remarkable number for a non-public school. About 55% have incomes of under $50,000. So we're clearly not serving a traditional non-public school market. That's one of the ways that we make the school available. Another is that we don't have any expectations of parents and families in terms of their own styles, their own family culture, the way parents interact with their children. We don't imply anything about parenting styles. We don't expect parents and families to change their philosophies, their worldviews. We don't expect them to do anything particular at home. And so we find that in our school community, we have what is sometimes really an astonishing array of patterns at home, ways of being a parent, and that too we regard as being democratic. That we don't want to make demands on the philosophies and worldviews of families.
Yeah. Do you find that those philosophies do sometimes shift in some way after they start at the school, or do they usually stay pretty steady?
I think it works both ways. We we hear from families, often new coming families, new arrivals will talk about after a few weeks or months how they're doing their own version of judicial committee at home, or they're voting on things. And while that's fun and it's a worthy experiment for families, it's not something that the Circle School encourages or discourages for that matter. So yeah, some families will adopt practices that are based on what we do at school. Many families, any family that stays with us over time is of course going to be influenced by the way the school works. But then there are many families too that continue to practice worldviews and ways of dealing, patterns of parent-child interactions that aren't really very similar to what happens at school. Again, part of being a democratic school to us means that that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So the Circle School, at least in what I've seen and read, you've described yourselves as practicing integral education, which is a little bit different than the Sudbury philosophy that we at ABS and some other schools have kind of attached ourselves to. And I wonder if you could explain kind of what that difference is.
That's a big question. The Circle School doesn't call itself a Sudbury school, as you point out. We do that because of differences in philosophy, in governance, in theory of education, and all of those are reflected in school culture, of course, but also for differences in practices. This is a subject I've thought a lot about, Mark. It's and actually it's discussed at some length in a forthcoming book that I've written about self-directed democratic schooling. I think instead of trying to characterize philosophical differences, let me talk about some concrete differences and see if you get a flavor of what that implies for philosophy and theory. But a couple of things I need to point out first. One, well, just like many of the self-identified Sudbury schools, the Circle School is a self-directed democratic school, and there is substantial similarity in the student experience at the Circle School. It's when you look more closely that you see some important differences. Second thing I want to point out is that when you ask for the comparison, it's not clear what we're comparing it to. You're asking about a Sudbury philosophy, really, but I don't think there is a philosophy that's shared in common by the schools that use that label. And that's one of the practical issues, actually. There is a lot of philosophical variation among those schools. Now, often it's unstated philosophy or vaguely stated philosophy, but there are also significant differences in practices. So the Sudbury label is not a reliable guide as to the nature of the school. Many of the so-called Sudbury schools, of course, are self-directed democratic schools, but there are some that are not. So really, I can tell you about some of the differences, but what I'm talking about, I suppose, is differences between the Circle School and maybe a typical or a composite of Sudbury schools. But it's important that I'm not saying that all of these differences apply to any particular school, and I'm not saying that any of these factors that make up some of the differences are part of defining what a Sudbury school is or the Sudbury model. Does that make sense, Mark?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And I think, yeah, just focusing on what the practices piece of it that you were talking about, that kind of what are the practices that you feel like make the Circle School unique?
I don't know about unique, but what makes us different from some of our colleagues, self-directed democratic schools, I can go through. I made a list of 10. Let me read through them and say a word about each one, and maybe that'll give you some idea of what I'm talking about. Number one, duty to supervise. Sudbury schools explicitly disclaim a duty to supervise children. The Circle School explicitly embraces a duty to supervise children and always has. Number two, open campus. Sudbury schools typically allow students to come and go during the school day. That's something that the Circle School has never allowed. Number three, high school diploma. Sudbury schools typically grant high school diplomas, and usually that's granted on the basis of a vote about the candidate. Students who receive a diploma, if they're voted to have successfully demonstrated something like their readiness to assume self-responsibility or some similar thesis. In 34 years, the Circle School has not yet issued a high school diploma. Number four, licensing. Sudbury schools are generally not licensed or accredited. The Circle School is licensed by the Pennsylvania Department of Education and always has been. Five, role of staff. Sudbury schools sometimes state or practice a principle of non-interference with children, freeing children to do what they naturally choose to do. And I'm putting naturally in air quotes here. The Circle School states a principle of practicing life is our tagline, practicing life in a scaled down society of children, teens, and adults freely interacting. Now, those two aren't exactly in conflict. They're not incompatible, but the circle school does not imply any principle of non-interference with kids. Number 6, relation to parents. Some Sudbury schools regard parents as a source of interference with children's development and see the school as a way to sort of insulate kids from that influence. In some schools, this has led to antagonism, parent-school antagonism, either chronic or in episodes. And I wonder if it's because that principle of interference is either not acknowledged or maybe not even really out there as a conscious thought. In contrast, the circle school regards parents and family as integral features in a child's life, and so there can be no interference. But on the other hand, just like the schools that call themselves Sudbury schools, the circle school regards the school primarily as a place where children act with independence from home and family. And the school, of course, strives to respect children's privacy in the same way or a similar way that we respect adults' privacy. Subtle differences there. Mm-hmm. But we do, I think, the common ground is probably that most of the self-directed democratic schools would think of their school as a place where kids can practice being apart from home and family, being out in the world with a measure of independence and privacy. Let's see, number 7, formal constitution. At most Sudbury schools that I know of, principles like rule of law and students' civil liberties are practiced by tradition, and they're reflected in the law book and rules, but they're not made explicit and formal in constitutional documents. I think the circle school is unusual in that we do state those principles explicitly, and they're sort of locked into protected constitutional documents, our bylaws articles of incorporation. Number 8, staff employment model. In most of the Sudbury schools, staff are hired for one-year terms, sort of modeling the election of public officials, and this grows from the New England town model. At the circle school, those staff members are hired by school meeting, more or less as conventional employees. That is, when we hire, we do so with the presumption that employment will continue for as long as both parties are satisfied with the arrangement. And there's the underlying idea there, modeling after a town meeting versus the circle schools model is very different. And that leads to a difference in governance structures either. But in fact, let's talk about that one next. Governance structure. Most of the Sudbury schools that I know are using either the what I think of as the old Sudbury style of assembly governance. That is, the assembly is the policy making and budget setting body that includes parents, or the new Sudbury style, which has only a school meeting. And that's the style that was adopted by Sudbury Valley School. That would have been the end of 2011. Now, like both of those, the circle school's school meeting is responsible for day-to-day management of the school. But unlike those other two, the circle school has a sort of a 3-body governance structure with checks and balances. We have a board of trustees that is empowered to preserve 3 things, really. Their primary mission is to preserve the school's democratic structure, to guard student civil liberties, and to preserve the school's long-term assets, such as real estate. And that's very different from, actually, that may be unique among the self-directed democratic schools to have an empowered board, and especially with that mission, which is not like other organizations, even non-school organizations. So I think that's 10 concrete differences. And there are some themes in there, some underlying patterns that are different.
Yeah. And one of the things that you touched on is that you don't issue a diploma. We presently do. And one of the things that we get asked all the time is, even with or without a diploma, whether or not the student is then able to go to college afterwards. And so I wonder, just from a different perspective, do you have a sense of how many of your students who choose to go to college end up going there and getting in, and kind of what that looks like from your side?
Yes, we have a very good read on that. We did a study of all of our graduates about 2 years ago or so. And what we found was that of students who spent at least their last 4 years at the Circle School, 84% went on to college. Of our lifers, that is, students who spent at least 8 years at the Circle School, 91% have gone on to college. Those numbers, of course, are way above the numbers in the general population. We also know from that study that our graduates collectively hold more bachelor's degrees, more master's degrees, and more doctoral degrees than their same age peer graduates from other kinds of schools. So, yes, we do know that the not having a high school diploma has not been an impediment for our students. We are licensed by the Pennsylvania Department of Education to issue high school diplomas. And in the early years, I think we thought that every student would want to do that. But what happened, I suppose, was that our, our graduates were getting into college without having the high school diploma. And so the habit, the pattern of documenting what they needed to document for a diploma kind of fell by the wayside. Um, and when you think about it, the high school diploma isn't, students don't commonly have a high school diploma, even in conventional schools, when they apply to and are admitted to college. They don't get that diploma until the end of their senior year. So not having the diploma itself is not a big difference for the colleges. What is not having a transcript. That's the big difference.
And how do you see people get around that?
Oh, all kinds of ways, Mark. The Most of our students on applying to college will submit a resume rather than a transcript, and the resume will list typically the school offices they've held. We have a couple dozen elected offices, as do most of the self-directed democratic schools. They will list the committees they've served on, maybe the corporations and the positions of responsibility in corporations. They'll list and describe the major projects they've undertaken. Some have done formal or informal studies of traditional academic subjects, and they may incorporate those in their resume. And then I think almost all of our students who are going on to college, which again is around 90%, almost all of them will take the SAT exams. And maybe ironically, but those SAT scores may be more important for kids coming from the Circle School and other democratic schools than they are for kids coming from conventional schools, because it's one way that kids can demonstrate their ability to do the kind of work that they're going to encounter at college, which is one of the two big things that we hear from college admissions people that they're looking for. They want to make sure that the students they admit will be able to thrive academically. And then they tell us they're also looking for students who will enhance the college community and enhance the life on their campus. Our kids tend to excel at that. Oh, also, I should say that when our kids take the SATs, most of them will do some formal preparation for the math side of the SAT. That formal preparation might be studying on their own. It might be one-on-one tutoring. It might be a small group class. But almost all of them will do formal preparation for that math side. But very few will do any preparation for the language side, the reading, writing, comprehension side of the SAT. And I think that's because our school environments are verbally intensive. I think there's very high verbal bandwidth, both written and oral.
Yeah, I think we see that too, that the math side is sometimes where people want to get a little more formal learning before they move on versus having to write a paper or even express themselves verbally because they've had so much practice doing it in some cases for their entire lives.
Yes,
So,
yes.
yeah, that's a good observation.
And I think what our kids focus on too, frankly, is taking the SAT. They may not care about learning the math, frankly, but they know they've got to learn it enough to be able to do well on the test or well enough to get into the school of their choice. And then in college admissions, there's another pattern altogether. Some students have very focused ambitions for college. They may want a particular program um, or a particular college for some very good narrow reason. And those students will tend to present a different kind of college application. For example, we had a student who wanted to who was wildly in love with the classics. Are you familiar with St. John's College? It's a
Not really,
it's
no.
based on study of the classics. It's a 4-year program,
Mm.
and the every incoming freshman reads exactly the same ancient classics. They start with the Greeks and they work forward in history over a 4-year period, but every student reads the same original texts and discusses them in seminar type classes. There are very few electives and it's mostly seminar type classes, which is uh, it's very highly academically structured. But we had a young woman who wanted to attend St. John's and approached them and said, I go to this Democratic school. I don't have a transcript. What would you suggest? How should I get in? How should I shape my admissions application? And they said, well, what have you been doing for the last 4 years? Well, she had been reading the classics. And
Mm.
so they said, well, put together a book list. So she spent a couple of months asking everybody she knew, what have you seen me reading? And she assembled a list of a couple of hundred books, which together included most of the curriculum for at least the first year of that program. This, as a 14-year-old, this girl had also, she studied Latin because she wanted to read some of the ancient Greeks in the original Latin that they had written in. So she and our external resources coordinator approached Dickinson College, which is in our area and happens to have a terrific classics department. And they said, hey, will you let her enter your Latin class? And the admissions office said, well, that's kind of unusual for a 14-year-old to be in a college class. But they said, look, if you can convince the professor to let you in, we'll let it happen. So she went to the professor with our external resources coordinator and explained what she wanted to do. And the professor said, well, what do you want to read? Why do you want to learn Latin? And she ticked off a couple of works, and the professor said, oh, well, that pretty much makes up the course that you want to take. I mean, that's what we're going to read. So he let her in. And she
Wow.
was the kid in the back of the room who always was raising her hand and had done the prep. She got a great grade in the class, and basically the professor said, and the admissions department said, send us more kids like that. Now, it's unusual for a student to have that narrowly focused an interest, but it happens sometimes. Another student of ours wanted to study with a particular researcher at the University of Delaware, and went to the admissions interview, and the interviewer always asks, why do you want to come to our school? And I imagine that they get answers like, oh, this is a great school, or oh, my mom went here, or if they're not too swift, they might say, well, it's a great party school. But
Yeah.
so this young lady sitting there, and she says, well, I want to work with Dr. So-and-so. I want to do the kind of research that she's doing. She has done so-and-so and so-and-so, and this is my special interest. Now, if you're an admissions rep and you get an answer like that, you've got to be impressed that, okay, this student has a great reason for coming to this college. But also, I imagine that as soon as she left the interview, that admissions officer was flipping through her Rolodex to see just who was this researcher who's attracting students.
Right.
So anyway, kids get into college many different ways. These days, one of the popular ways to do it is to first spend a year or two at a community college. We are very fortunate in Harrisburg to have one of the best community colleges in the country. So many students, some students will go there, spend 2 years there, save themselves tens of thousands of dollars, and then transfer. Now, 30 years ago, transfer students weren't necessarily welcomed at traditional four-year colleges, but these days, the traditional colleges, the four-year colleges, welcome transfer students because they're independent, typically they're highly motivated, and so our kids when they go that route typically will get in very quickly to where they want to go after community college.
Yeah, we found almost exactly the same thing. And in many cases, that's the advice that we give people when they say, "Oh, I want to go to whatever Denver Metro." We can say, "Well, or if you don't want to jump through all these hoops, then you could start at this 2-year school and go from there." And we found kids have a great deal of success with that
Yeah.
too in our area. Yeah, that's wonderful. I love those stories. Those are things like I think there's just I can hear all of the parents just breathing a sigh of relief as they hear
Oh yeah.
those.
Oh yeah.
Um,
And the study I mentioned of our graduates is available on our website. We blogged about it, and it can be downloaded from the blog site.
and would you say your website so people can go look? And I'll put it in the show notes as well. But
Oh sure. The website is circleschool.org.
got
All
it.
one word, circleschool.org.
And are you guys on social media?
Yes, we have a Facebook page, and we also tweet.
And can we find you by just searching Circle School on either of those platforms?
Yes. Now there is another Circle School in Texas. We are not that. We're the one in Pennsylvania. But another way of finding it, of course, is just go to our website, and you can. There's a link there to our Facebook page, to our YouTube page, to Twitter, and I think there may be another one or two. But right from our website, you can get to those very easily as well.
Great, great. So, one of the things I am interested to know is just kind of your thoughts on the future for the Circle School. Are there things that you are hoping for, that you're kind of on a trajectory for, that you would be interested in sharing?
Well, we have just moved into a brand new campus. We've got 9 acres, or 8 acres, and 9,000 square feet. We have seen a surge in enrollment. We're at 87 at the moment. And so there's lots new that's going on for us. This is the future we've been working for now about 10 or 15 years. And it's a wonderful new campus. I expect that the future will bring additional growth. I think one of the things I've been fascinated by the never-ending novelty that we see at school. Hardly a week goes by without something new happening, even after decades. And now in a new campus with new challenges and new situations, we're seeing an awful lot of that. Our law book, which has about 200 laws in it, is we just can't keep up with all the changes we need to make to it. Being in a new campus, I think probably 20 or 30% of our rules are either obsolete or need to be amended, adapted to our new campus. But for the future, I think I would love to see lots more self-directed democratic schools. I think that we, over the 34 years we've been around, have seen some big shifts in public acceptance and educators' acceptance. We have a steady stream of conventional educators who come in to see the school, to learn from it. We had a group of 4 educators from a very traditional private academic school asked to come study us, and they did for a day. They want to introduce more elements of play in their program, and their understanding of the Circle School was that it's a program built on play, which is an interesting take on the school.
Yeah.
I think life is play, And I think that's what they were detecting. But so I expect to see greater interest from conventional educators. I see in the publishing world in recent years, we've seen more trade books published and more interest in a broader way in democratic schooling. And I look for that to happen as well. I think one of the things that we stand for as democratic schools that's really hard for people to buy, or for maybe for conventional worldview, I'm not sure what it is, but I want children in school to find happiness, not the not momentary fireworks, but kind of the saturating joy that kids find in living a life of purpose and meaning. I think it's that the idea that school can and should provide fulfilling lives for kids today, not in preparation for tomorrow, but today. I think that idea is gaining traction, and I hope it will continue to do so. And I think that I'm sure some people hear that and think, well, that's sentimental or starry-eyed. But I don't think it is. I think one of the things we've learned over the 34 years we've been around is that character and intelligence emerge from kids, their passionate struggling with personally meaningful challenges. And I think there's no better way to develop personally meaningful challenges than to give kids bounded freedom and shared responsibility, which I think are foundational pieces of democratic schooling.
I feel like we should engrave that over the door.
Yeah.
I love that. It's such a wonderful way to put that. Fantastic. So the question I always end with all of my guests is if they have a favorite memory of life at Alpine Valley School. But of course, I will accept, since you're not necessarily part of our community, that you could have a favorite memory from the Circle School to share.
I have lots of favorite memories, but I guess the one that comes to mind is when we threw out the law book, when we threw out the rules. It was just a few years ago. And it was a fascinating development. It began when a mischievous teenager came to school and made a motion to throw out all the laws, throw out the law book, and did it with a big grin on his face. And of course, he had brought lots of friends with him, so his motion got seconded, and it was debated. Well, the debate, I think they were shocked because it got serious consideration. And the debate, it turns out, took place over 4 or 5 weeks, and we spent hours on the floor of school meeting discussing it, and many hours outside of school meeting discussing it. Things, we got down to the level of, why do we have laws at all? Why do we need this law? Why do we need that law? And it became a very serious discussion with at one point a teenage girl breaking into tears and saying, if we throw out the law book, I know that my parents are going to pull me out of this school. The debate went on, and somebody amended it and said, well, how about let's just do it for a short period, maybe a day. And then somebody else said, well, how about if we just do it for an hour? And at that point, there was a clear majority at that point that was willing to go for it, but had to go a little further. And there were some rules that we didn't throw out. Rules that involved harm to people and property were still going to stay in place. And we designated one room, I forget what we called it, maybe a safe room, but it was a room where all of the normal rules would stay in effect. And then we did it. We voted it in. And at the designated time, the school meeting chairperson rang a bell, and it was we were free of rules. And so kids were sitting on top of the refrigerator, up on tables, climbing the walls. I mean, literally climbing the walls. My favorite, though, was 3 boys who had brought in, 2 had brought in skateboards, and 1 had brought in a scooter. And we have a narrow hallway, or we did then, this was in our old campus. They put up orange safety cones in doorways along the hall, and then they skateboarded down the hallway and into the library, where they would then do flips and tricks. And it was so deliciously outlaw. It was wonderful.
I think you're going to give our kids ideas.
Yeah, I hope so. I recommend it. I think the most meaningful part was the leading up to it. It was the debate about it, and the fears and the hopes and the mischief, the ideas for mischief that came up. It was a wonderful discussion, and then a wonderful event.
And it seems so much like it characterizes what's so great about, or what can be so great about the self-directed democratic schooling of like, we can still have some boundaries where people feel safe, but we can also just see what happens when we go nuts.
Yes. And it's a very real way of demonstrating that anything's possible. You can think up an idea and make it happen, which I think is one of the most profound features of self-directed democratic schools, that students are empowered to think up an idea and then make it happen.
That's so wonderful. And on that note, I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much for taking the time and sharing about life at your school and just your perspective that I think just like crystallizes so well what's great about our different styles of education. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark, for the forum and for this series of podcasts.
I don't know about you, but personally, there are so many parts of that conversation that I want to just go back and replay over and over until they sink in. Jim's turn of phrase is just such a gift, and I feel so grateful to have him as part of our democratic schooling community. There's like at least 3 things that I want to needlepoint and hang over my desk that he said. The good news is that besides this podcast, we actually have several videos of Jim speaking at Alpine Valley School. We recorded a talk that he gave at our school, and you can listen to all of those if you want more of his deep wisdom. You can find them at youtube.com/Alpine Valley School. And I'll put a link in the show notes to, in particular, some of the videos that have been really popular from that talk. Again, the show notes for this episode are available at alpinevalleySchool.com/podcast/EP20. In the show notes, in addition to the videos that I just talked about, you'll also find some information on the Circle School's website, Jim's contact information if you ever want to reach out to him directly, and the Circle School's social media that he mentioned in the show. If you want to get in touch with the show, you can reach us at podcast@alpinevalley.school.com, or you can find Alpine Valley School on social media on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram by searching for Alpine Valley School. Something that we are just starting to do is to diversify what kind of content we are posting on each of these accounts. So I recommend that you follow us, friend us, tweet us, whatever it is that you have to do on each of the platforms to get that information. Instagram, we're posting a daily picture when school is in session, called the photo of the day. Twitter, we're sharing quotes from school, things that happen throughout the day, retweeting a bunch of really interesting articles from kind of friends of the school and other democratic schools. And Facebook, we're starting to go through some of the content that we have on our blog, some interesting articles, as well as videos and photos that you won't find anywhere else. So we really recommend that you follow us on all 3 of those channels so that you can get the most benefit. If you do any shopping on Amazon.com, and I know you do, we can get some great benefit from that as a nonprofit. If you go to smile.amazon.com, anytime you do any shopping on Amazon, whether you're ordering toilet paper or notebooks or a Google Pixel book, and a percentage of your purchase, if you use Amazon Smile, will go to Alpine Valley School. It's 0 cost to you, very little effort. In fact, Amazon Smile will even remember that you've used it before, and if you just go to plainoldamazon.com, it'll try to redirect you, and the school benefits. In fact, we've gotten a lot of benefit out of this in the last couple of years when people have really started to use it heavily. So I really want to encourage you, if you are a friend of the school and you want to help us out, super easy way to do that. And we see a great deal of benefit from it. So thanks to everyone who's already using Amazon Smile. And if you're not, we would love it if you would start. Thanks for listening. I'm Mark Gallivan. This is the Alpine Valley School podcast, and we'll be back again in 2 weeks with more stories of real learning for real life.